All right, girls, welcome to the second portion of your review podcast for your test this Friday on early Renaissance art. So we are now in Italy, primarily Florence. We are in the 15th century. I'm going to try to go as quickly as possible and just go over things I know you will be tested on. So here's Florence. We talked about how we have all of these city-states kind of feuding with one another. Siena is, this important city-state, but is eventually taken over by Florence. So now Florence is kind of the center of Renaissance art. Okay, so all of the art and architecture we're looking at is in Florence. So think about all of these new technologies that are coming about. This new way of thinking, of course, is humanism, which we've spent time talking about that. And just make sure you know some key characteristics or tenets of the early Renaissance, which I've put in the last slide for you. So if you don't know them, you can go to that slide and read them. Again, focusing on bolded information, underlined information. So you want to remember the movable metal type is invented by the German Johann Gutenberg in 1469, which allows this common vernacular to be printed and distributed. And so this is important. So these important books that are written, the example that they discuss in the text is the Divine Comedy by Dante. This is printed, and those who are educated in Florence can begin reading this information. So just this focus on the secular. We're not rejecting religion. We're still seeing biblical subject matter, but it is now becoming combined with classical subject matter, or we're seeing totally, pagan subject matter, which has not occurred since antiquity, since the time of the Greeks and the Romans. So as we go through, think about what classical elements you see in the art and architecture that we're looking at. All right, and also remember that the Renaissance, of course, means rebirth, or, the rebirth of all of these classical ideas. And we talked about how artists and architects are using these ideas as inspiration. They're not necessarily copying off of them, they're building upon them, they're improving them, they're making them better. So one big one, of course, is linear perspective, which was perfected by Filippo Brunelleschi, all right, who is also responsible for the Duomo, for constructing the dome of the Florence Cathedral. And what I may not have mentioned in class is that that cathedral, the Florence Cathedral, was actually commissioned by the Medicis, this very wealthy banking family that we know become important patrons of this time. So you need to remember that. And of course, if you didn't already, make sure you take the time to watch these Sister Wendy videos. And I have another bolded underlined statement here, which of course we should know by now. Florence played the most important role in the development of Renaissance ideas and art forms in the early 15th century. And you also want to remember that the Florentines sort of rejected medieval and Gothic art. They considered it to be barbaric. They did not like these flat gold backgrounds with this lack of space and these floating people who are very rigid. They saw that as, you know, uncouth, I guess, and they really admired the work of the Greeks and the Romans. So that's where this whole influence of Greco-Roman culture comes into play. Okay, here's some more important items for you. And this is what I didn't get to in class. That is important and that you need to know. So in the beginning of the chapter, they talk about the doors of the Florence Baptistry. And I have a picture of it that I'll get to, but the baptistry, of course, is mainly used for baptizing children. And it is part of the cathedral, but not attached to the cathedral, which I didn't know. So on this building, there are these giant bronze doors, and at the beginning of the chapter, they talk about this competition. So all of the well-known artists in Florence are called to create these panels depicting the sacrifice of Isaac. And then one of them would be chosen, and they would be given the commission. They'd be paid to do these gigantic bronze doors on the north side, I believe, of the baptistry. And this was important because the Florence Cathedral is really the symbol of Florence. And the doors would be facing the cathedral. They would be there for all to see. So, the person who gets this commission would be, really in demand after this. So 7 artists, I think, are they come down to 7 artists, and we only have 2 panels. So this is the test. These were the test panels. So the 2 that are saved that we can actually see and look at are Filippo Brunelleschi, who we know, and Lorenzo Ghiberti. Okay, so if we take a look at both of these side by side, what differences do you see? What evidence of classical antiquity do you see? Okay, so think about that, and I'm going to go back to Brunelleschi. So this piece is described, first of all, note that it's in this quatrefoil frame, kind of interesting, because we would associate that really with Gothic art, okay? But beyond that, you see a lot of classical influence in the drapery, in the figures themselves. However, in Brunelleschi, the main difference here, I'm just going to get down to the point, is that Brunelleschi's panel contains a lot more emotion, a lot more feeling. It's very vigorous. The text used the word sturdy, okay? And in case you don't know the story of the sacrifice of Isaac is that God asks Abraham to sacrifice his only son Isaac to show his devotion to the Lord. And then as Abraham is about to cut his throat, an angel kind of swoops in and saves him and says, you've already proven yourself. You don't have to go through with this. So that's what we're looking at. So then if we look at Ghiberti's, if we compare, and don't confuse Ghiberti with Alberti. So there's Lorenzo Ghiberti, and then there is Leone Battista Alberti, who, hopefully you remember, wrote the important book on painting and architecture that was extremely influential. So if we compare it to Ghiberti's panel, this is softer, and I think it's more reminiscent of Greece and Rome, particularly in this image of Isaac. If you look at his nude body, here's a closer image for you. It's really reminiscent of early Greek statuary. You can see all of the muscles in the body. It's kind of twisted in this interesting position. It's far from rigid. It's very reminiscent of early Greek nude statuary. By the way, this is one of the first known nude depictions since classical antiquity, okay? And this is not a freestanding nude. Hopefully you remember that the freestanding nude, the first time we see a freestanding nude since classical antiquity is in Donatello's sculpture of the David. This is not a freestanding sculpture, it's a relief sculpture, okay? Also note this decoration of acanthus leaves on this altar, which, is a reference to ancient Rome. Okay? You also see foreshortening in the angel. Hopefully we understand what that means now. And since I need to stop babbling here, basically Ghiberti's panel is chosen. One of the reasons being that he was able to cast his panel with only 2 pieces of bronze, whereas Brunelleschi needed many pieces of bronze. So it would have been more costly if they would have gone with Brunelleschi's method. So after Ghiberti's chosen, it takes him about 20 years to complete the doors. Here's the completed doors, which are quite beautiful. And here they are on the Florence Baptistry. This is the Baptistry in Florence, so they're pretty cool. And I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Okay, here's another well-known fresco. So this is in the Brancacci Chapel. The title is Tribute Money. So this is actually a detail from a much larger series of paintings. So we talked about Masaccio and why he's important. And can you remember who he's influenced by? Well, hopefully you do because it's right here. He's influenced by Giotto. We talked about how Giotto used that soft modeling for his figures and, you know, makes them look weighty and three-dimensional. Well, Masaccio sort of takes that a step further. So we still see the soft modeling, we still see the chiaroscuro, but we also see a definite light source here, okay? So the light source here is clearly coming from the right, illuminating the robes, okay? You clearly have cast shadows, which is important. And then beyond that, the incorporation of emotion and drama in his work is a step up from Giotto. So he learned how to make his figures weighty and three-dimensional by looking at the work of Giotto, but adds this psychological element and the defined light source. Clearly it's off to the right again. So just remember that about Masaccio. This is another important painting by Masaccio, and I talked about how you need to be able to recall artworks that exemplify the tenets of the early Renaissance, and this would be a great one. So think about what could you talk about that illustrates early Renaissance. Well, hopefully you mentioned or you thought about this architecture that we're looking at. Okay, so you have the coffered ceiling, reminiscent of the Pantheon, the Roman arch, okay, the fluted engaged pilasters, okay, these flat things projecting from the wall, the unfluted Ionic columns that we have here. Remember, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. And of course, the use of linear perspective. This is a really great artwork for talking about linear perspective because of this intense sense of depth we get. It looks like we're kind of looking through this, this tunnel at the Holy Trinity. So just a good example of meshing biblical subject matter with classical themes, classical architecture. And here's the linear perspective for you can see the orthogonal lines and the vanishing point. And remember how I talked about the 3 triangles that are hidden in there somewhere. So really based on, biblical subject matter, but really at the heart of this is linear perspective and mathematics. Okay, you definitely have to know the Duomo, which is, this attached dome with the lantern on top that was designed by Filippo Brunelleschi. So here he's sort of making his comeback, commissioned by the Medicis, and know why he used an ogival dome rather than a hemispherical dome. What is the difference? I explained it in class. What were the advantages of using that ogival dome? Be able to discuss that. Here we have the 2 statues of David by Donatello and Rocio. Be able to identify them and discuss their similarities and differences, and just remember that Donatello is responsible for introducing this contrapposto or this weight shift. So he's the first guy really to do that since classical antiquity, since Critios' boy. So that's also clearly important. Okay, and of course the Camera degli Sposi, or the Room of the Newlyweds, painted by Andrea Mantegna. And we looked at this in class briefly, and I talked about how the entire thing is covered with fresco, and this is all an illusion here. All of these arches that are painted here is, it's completely an illusion, which is pretty cool. And you can also see that again here with the trompe l'oeil and the di sotto in su. So just make sure you know his name. And I'm basically out of time, girls, so make sure you study this slide. Definitely know